Today, we're happy to be joined by Jerry Brito and Veronique DeRougy. Jerry is a senior research fellow with the Regulatory Studies program at Mercatus Center at George Mason University. His research interests include regulation, telecommunications policy, and government transparency. And he's also a contributor to the Tech Liberation Front, which is a information blog found on the internet. So if you guys want to find out some of his tech-related research, please feel free to go there, or to Mercatus Center. He's got a lot of stuff with us as well. Veronique DeRougy is also a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center. Her research interests include federal budget, homeland security, tax competition, and financial privacy issues. She holds a PhD in economics from the University of Paris-Sorbonne. And if you guys could join me in welcoming Jerry, I'm sorry, Vera's going to be starting out today. I apologize. So if you can join me in welcoming Veronique DeRougy.
So, hello. Enjoy your lunch. And while we're starving on this side of the aisle, I'm joking. Anyway, so I think the midnight regulation issue is very timely, right? Because we are right in the middle of the midnight period. Midnight regulations are those regulations that are issued in the last days of an administration. Depending on the scholars, there are different ways we define the midnight period. In our paper, we've used the last quarter of an administration, but technically the midnight period starts the day after the election until the inauguration. But, there's just like a few days lag between the two. But I would just like to give you the heads up. So midnight regs are those last minute regulations issued by an administration. That's what they are. Interestingly, it's really not a partisan issue. Everyone does it. Every president in office has done it, and every president in the future will do it. Democrats, Republicans, they have all done it, as far as we can remember. But now we also have the data to prove it. So the term was initially coined because after the Carter administration left office, scholars started to count the number of pages in the Federal Register and noticed like this massive explosion. It was over 24,000 pages added to the Federal Register. After the Clinton years, it was over 26,000. It was 26,500. But obviously, it's not, again, a Democratic issue. President Bush, the first one, in spite of having issued a moratorium to issue no regulation in his last year, saw a massive increase in the number of pages in the Federal Register. And we are on track to see the biggest explosion ever on this issue with this administration. So again, I cannot stress enough the fact that this is not a partisan phenomenon. Every single administration has done it with very, very few exceptions. The number of pages in the Federal Register is the proxy that we've used to measure the midnight regulation phenomenon. It's an imperfect one because obviously, it's one that actually tells you about regulatory activity, but it doesn't tell you whether there's an increase in the number of regulation. It doesn't tell you whether it's deregulation, because obviously deregulating takes a lot of pages too, right? So, but it does clearly tell you something about regulatory activity. And what we've observed is a significant increase. 8 years ago, Jay Cochran at the Mercatus Center produced the first empirical study looking at this phenomenon. And last year in March, Anthony Davis and I updated his model to actually look. What we did was that we had an extended data set, and we had monthly data rather than quarterly data. We cleaned up the data set, and one of the things also that we did is that we wanted to compare the increase in the number of pages in the Federal Register for a given administration and compare it to another quarter, any other quarter for this administration. So we were comparing administration with themselves, if that makes any sense, which the Cochrane model didn't do. And one of the things that you can see here in this chart is that the way we cut it is that we actually looked at the average increase per quarter during midnight reg periods, which are the one in red, and during the regular quarter. And one of the things that we find, to sum it up, is like on average, regulations are issued at a pretty constant pace. So roughly in a given year, you have every quarter 25% of the rules are going to be issued in the Federal Registers. They come out, in a given year, and for each quarter, 25% of the pages increase for a given year will happen in each quarter, with the exception of the midnight period, where, in fact, you can see that a larger percentage of pages issued for that given year will come out during that time compared to any other. There are two noticeable exceptions. The first one is after President Ford, and I actually don't know why it happened, because when you look at other measure, it looks as if he actually regulated enough during that period. But for some reason, when you look with this measure, it looks as if when Ford left office, he didn't change really the pace of the number of pages issued in the Federal Register, didn't change that much. The second exception, and I've actually, I've emailed Chris Demuth, who used to be in the staff and the Ford staff, asked him whether he knew why that was. I asked the guy who wrote the biography for Dick Cheney, and they didn't really know. So if any of you have any insights into this exception, I would be really interested in hearing it. The other exception is the end of the first term of the Reagan administration. I mean, it seems pretty easy to actually understand. I mean, I think there was pretty much a guarantee of re-election, even though there's never any guarantee. And this administration supposedly had a philosophy of not regulated. But as I said, commitment to not regulating doesn't really say anything. The first Bush issued a moratorium, and it really didn't change anything. This other chart represents this exact same thing, but the data cut a little different way, where we have like all the dots are like the number of pages at any given time, and we can see, like the smoother line is like shows the trend in number of pages increased over the years, and you can see, that it increased really fast in the 70s and then went down in the 80s and then started picking up again in the 90s. But one of the things that we see is that after the midnight period, you have a clear increase in those pages, in the number of pages issued during the midnight period. What the data tells us is basically we looked, we have a model, and we could point to you on our website to show you the model and also make the data available to you if you would like to. Like, it tells us something. During the midnight period, on average, there is a 17% increase over the other period in the number of pages issued in the Federal Register compared to non-midnight period. That's a pretty significant issue. Another thing that it tells us, and it's bipartisan and systematic, another thing that it tells us is that the number of days that Congress is in office is in session before the midnight period, in the month before the midnight period starts, has a significant impact on the pace at which regulations are going to come out, or the number of pages in the Federal Register are going to be increased. So the more Congress is in session, the faster or the more pages will be added during the midnight period. The other thing that it tells us is the rate of turnover of the executive order and of the executive cabinet has also an impact. So, for instance, if you're at the end of a first term, right, even if there's uncertainty, you know that if the party is going to be, stay in power for a second term, it is likely that the rate of turnover of those cabinet positions is going to be lower. Well, what we find is that the number of pages added then during the midnight period is smaller than when they are actually losing to another party, and then the rate of turnover is actually pretty high. So basically what it says is that the midnight regulation phenomenon is even stronger when the party is expected or knows it's going to be replaced by the other party. So these are actually basically the basic finding, the data. And again, please, feel free to ask us. We'll be happy to share the model that we used and the data that we have. So what causes this phenomenon? The first major explanation, because there's a big literature actually in political science telling us that, in the last day of an administration, lame ducks, presidents really do not have that much power or that ability to actually do things. And what we're actually showing with the midnight phenomenon is that actually they do have power to do things. So why is it that we're seeing this? Well, the first issue is, the first reason is that during the midnight period, everyone's busy preparing transitions. Everyone's doing other things. Everyone's trying to push their own things. So basically, fewer people are looking. It's easier to push things through the process, right? But also, more importantly, the administration and the head of the agency or the people who are the political appointees have actually an increased incentive because they know they're going to be out to actually push as much stuff out the door during that time. So there is an incentive to do so, but it's also the ability to do it. One of the main reasons that political scientists identify for wanting to do it is that it is a really great way to extend your influence into the future and into the other administration, especially when you know that the new administration is not going to share your belief on a lot of issues. They're not going to have your priorities. They're probably not going to pursue your agenda. So this is the time, and you have the means to do it, to actually push and extend your influence. It is also the time where you can actually kind of secure your legacy. You would assume that 8 years should have been enough, but no, this is actually a great tool to secure your legacy. Waiting is another reason to do it. Again, because there's a lot of people who are actually doing a lot of things. Waiting could be actually a very effective strategy. You know that you're not going to be reelected. You're not going to actually seek reelection. You try to actually wait until the end where you can do things that you would not do otherwise. So not only aren't people really looking, right, so which makes it easy, but also you don't have to fear disapproval, or you don't have to fear consequences for pushing things that people would otherwise disapprove. So that's another reason. Delay is another one, which is basically trying to benefit from the fact that no one's watching, but also procrastination. There's all this stuff. It's kind of like a natural tendency, right? All these things that you should have been doing. You know you're going to be gone, so you do it basically right now because you have to push everything out. So there is this natural tendency, even if you're not trying to tie the hand of your successor, even without it's the end. You're trying to get as much stuff out the door, things that you should probably have been doing before, but you waited too long. So is this an effective strategy? Because you can imagine that what a president does on its last days, when obviously he's been kicked out of office, right? So if he has this power to do so much thing, you can imagine that an administration, and Jerry will cover these points later in the second part of this talk, an administration could actually, an incoming administration could actually undo it really easily. If it's easy to push this stuff out, it's got to be easy to get rid of it. So there's actually interesting data about this. Two law professors published a law review article where they collected data looking at what happened to the regulations, to the final rules during the midnight period when Clinton came into office, so basically the midnight regulations for the first Bush, and then looked at what this President Bush did with the Clinton administration's midnight rules. So they looked and tried to see what happened to these rules. Were they amended? Were they withdrawn? Were they, did they stay the way it was? They were. And what they find is that 9%, right? It's 9% of the Bush 1 midnight regs were withdrawn. 9%. So that's not a large amount. 48% of those rules were amended. But what it means is that effectively 43% of the midnight regs for Bush 1 stayed intact and went through. So pretty effective. But look at this. The Clinton midnight regulations, what happened to them, right? You would think that the Bush administration would be pretty gung-ho against, Clinton regulation, and yet, I guess it's only 3%, 3% of the Clinton regs were withdrawn. More interestingly, it was 15% were amended. Only 15% were amended. And 82% of the rules issued by President Clinton and his team during the midnight period went through and stayed the way they were. And it tells you that it's a very, very effective strategy to actually push stuff out, to extend your influence into the future, to tie the hands of the guy who's coming, because it's going to actually take him. Is it worth it? What the new president's got to be thinking is it worth it to use my political capital right now to actually go after these rules? And Jerry's going to talk about what it takes to kind of withdraw these rules, which is one of the reasons why it is so hard, and you see that it's such an effective strategy. But it remains really interesting. These numbers remain really interesting, that when you would have expected that the Bush administration coming in would have actually tried to get rid of much more of the Clinton regs than it actually did. But here we see 82% of those rules were unaffected and went into effect. So now, sorry?
Did you research on how long it usually takes to roll back the regulations?
Well, so Jerry's going to talk about this, but it's actually really costly. You have to go, I don't want to, actually I'm going to turn it over to Jerry so I don't step on his, so Jerry?
Thank you.
That's right.
Tag team. So to answer your question, it depends on how you go about reversing a rule, right? If you, for example, if you use a Congressional Review Act, which I'll get to in a minute, you could potentially reverse it pretty quickly. But if you have to initiate a rulemaking to undo the rulemaking that just went through, that could potentially be take a long time. So, but to directly answer your question, no, I haven't personally seen research about that, but there might be some out there. So what's wrong with midnight regulations, right? The fact that you have a dramatic spike at the end of a presidential term and the number of regulations that are put out is only really a problem in itself if you believe that all regulation is a bad thing, right? But I certainly don't believe that. So you have to ask, the question, why is this spike a bad thing? And there are a couple of reasons. The first reason is a lack of accountability during the midnight period, right? This is game theory 101. When you make a move, right, and you have an opponent or opponents around you, when you make a move, you take into consideration not just the effect of that move, but what effect that will have on your opponent's calculation about the next move, right? Well, when you have the midnight period, which is after the election, the sitting president knows whether he won or lost the election, whether his party won or lost the election, and he knows that he's not going to be in office the next time around, and he knows that the next president is going to be of the opposite party, perhaps, and knows that the next president is going to have priorities and policies the opposite of his. So he's freed at that point. Why? Because there is no next period. The president no longer ever again has to face the voters, right? He's on his way out, either because he served an 8-year term or because he was kicked out of office. And in that case, he knows he never has to face the voters again, and he can do something that he might otherwise not do if he had that political check of the voters. He also knows that he doesn't have to work with Congress again, right? Presidents take into account what their moves are, what Congress will think about it, because Congress is a political check. But during the midnight period, he knows, I'm never going to have to work with these guys again. I'm never going to have to compromise. So there is really a lack of accountability during the midnight period. Another argument that you see in the legal literature is that midnight regulations are undemocratic. And, I don't know how I feel about this. I'm sort of sympathetic to it, to this argument, but I'll tell you what it is. What it is very simple. It's after the election, right? The president knows what the will of the American people is. It's very fresh. The American people went out on election day and voted and spoke and said, this is what we want. In this case, for example, they voted for Barack Obama. They want those policies, presumably. So for the sitting president to come out and issue rules that are the opposite of what the American people just spoke for is sort of seen as undemocratic. Of course, the argument on the other side is the American people also voted for the sitting president and to have him until January 20th. So it is his prerogative to issue those rules. But it is something to keep in mind. Another argument that's made is that midnight regulations are inefficient and wasteful. The outgoing president wastes time making rules that he knows the next administration is going to try to undo, and the incoming administration wastes time undoing rules that never had a chance of standing around. I'm not sure this is really. I mean, there is something to this, but because it's so difficult to get a rule undone, a lot of presidents, I think, don't even bother, which goes to the accountability and the undemocratic. But to the extent that the president does have to spend some political capital trying to undo a regulation, you are going to have some inefficiency and waste there. And finally, this is another critique that is in the legal literature, and people really can't put their finger on it, but they basically say that there's something unseemly, something unprincipled about this, something unpresidential. And I think there's something to this, right? I like to compare midnight regulations to last-minute pardons, right? Inevitably, at the end of every presidential term, you have a president issue a bunch of pardons to unsavory characters that the American people aren't really, happy with. And you have to ask yourself, well, boy, if he had 8 years or 4 years in office, why didn't he do it earlier? Why did he wait till the last minute? Well, it's because he's probably doing something he really shouldn't, be doing. And that goes again to the accountability. And so accountability to me really is the main reason. So these are the reasons that you see in the legal literature. But there's another reason that we bring up in our paper, which is going to be published in the Admin Law Review, which is that midnight regs dilute oversight. Specifically, we're talking about regulatory review. And how many of you here are familiar with the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at OMB? Okay, some of you, good. Oh, some of you probably work for it because you're smiling. Maybe. So OIRA at OMB is an office to which, whenever an agency wants to regulate, put out a new rule, it must submit its rule to OIRA for review. And OIRA reviews the rule to make sure that the rule is justified, it's cost justified, to make sure that it follows administration policy, that the agency has the authority to put out that rule. And this is a nonpartisan procedure, right? This was started way back. You can trace regulatory review back to Richard Nixon and his quality of life review process. But every president since then, Republican and Democrat, has extended the OIRA review process. And I'll get into that in a minute. But what happens is that OIRA reviews a certain amount of regulation. And like Vera said, the growth of regulation during a normal period grows at a constant rate. At the end of administration, however, OIRA is flooded with a number of regulations that it probably isn't prepared to review, and so it can't possibly give all this flood, this spike of regulation, adequate review. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So, what the heck is an OIRA? All right, let me try to explain it to you. So again, like I said, it was really Richard Nixon who started the regulatory review process. After EPA was created under his administration, you had the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. EPA got started, and they started regulating. They started implementing the acts. And then the White House got the bill. And they were like, oh, this is kind of expensive. And so they wanted to make sure that they were getting something for the money, and that they had considered alternatives. And so they instituted a procedure whereby all agencies, before they regulated, they had to submit to the White House the regulation. And what the White House did was that it checked it. And again, you have to understand, this is the president checking his own administration, right? The president goes out and appoints a head to all the different agencies, but he really can't keep an eye on them 24/7, right? So OIRA is his way to make sure that they're doing what he wants them to do. The other thing that OIRA does, and that Nixon did with his quality of life review committee, was that sometimes you'll have, let's say EPA bans a certain pesticide, right? It's following its congressional command to do something about the environment, bans a particular pesticide. Well, the Department of Agriculture might not like that because it has constituents that don't like that. So OIRA brings these folks together to make sure that the right thing is being done. So again, President Ford continued this regulatory review. President Carter continued it. President Reagan issued Executive Order 12291 and put this regulatory review process in OIRA for the first time. The first President Bush continued it. President Clinton issued Executive Order 12866, which is the executive order under which OIRA operates today. And so that's what it is. So how does it work? So very simply, I won't get into the nitty-gritty of how it works. But basically, an agency wants to issue a rulemaking, right? Before it can publish it in the Federal Register to seek public comment, it must give it to OIRA. OIRA reviews and, let's say, approves the regulation or approves the proposed regulation. It goes to the Federal Register for public comment. The agency finalizes the rule. It then goes back to OIRA. OIRA at that point can say, yes, this which works, in which case it's published in the Federal Register, or no. At that point, the agency can withdraw the rule and start again, or actually revise the rule and start again, or it can withdraw the rule altogether. So, in a nutshell, that's the OIRA process. All right? More or less? So how does OIRA judge regulations? Right, what criteria do they use? The criteria that they use is spelled out in Executive Order 12866, which, like I said, is a Clinton executive order. And it uses, I'm just going to go over some bullet points about what they look at. First, they look at whether the agency identified outcomes, right? What is this regulation trying to accomplish? Right, because you need to know what you're trying to do to then judge whether the way you're trying to do it will get you there. The second thing is that the agency consider alternatives, right? What alternatives, whether they're market alternatives or other regulatory alternatives, did the agency consider? Because you don't want a regulator to just, a regulator has a hammer, everything's going to be a nail. You want them to really think about what sort of alternatives they can use. Identify the costs. Right? How much is this regulation going to cost to the budget and to the economy? And how much are the different alternatives going to cost? And then compare the cost with the outcomes, right? This is what you're trying to do. This is how much the different alternatives cost. Consider, whether your costs justify your outcomes. And it doesn't necessarily say pick the cheapest regulation or the cheapest alternative. It just says consider the alternatives, consider the cost of each alternative. Finally, does the regulation comport with administration policy? And like I said, this is where you have interagency review. So where does all of this fit into midnight regulations? Well, let's look at the resources available to OIRA. So this is the budget and the staffing of OIRA. And this is in 2007 dollars, so it's constant for inflation. As we can see, in 1981, when OIRA was created, OIRA had a budget of almost $10 million. And that's gone up and down, but today OIRA has a budget of just about $7 million. This is remarkable to me because this is the one government agency I've ever known whose budget has decreased in real terms over any period of time. Same goes for its staffing. When OIRA started, its staffing was about just over 90 full-time equivalent employees, and today there are about 50. So definitely a downward trend. But that's not a problem in of itself, right? There might be different priorities. And certainly after the Clinton executive order, which shrunk the number of regulations that OIRA is responsible for looking at, you might need less resources to do that. But nevertheless, that's the resources. So this is the OIRA's workload. Here I separated it out by quarters. Now these are not Federal Register pages, right? When we look at Federal Register pages as a proxy for the Midnight Regulations phenomenon, we do that because it's really impossible to count how many regulations are issued because there's just so many thousands of them. But when you can look at how many regulations OIRA looks at because this is a much smaller set. And so these are how many regulations OIRA reviewed by quarter. And you can see that when you do have a change in administration to the opposite party, you do have a spike in the number of regulations that OIRA is asked to review. So let's put it together. This here is a little bit different. What I did here was, what did I do here? So this is, this is midnight period. So I took election day, and I chose November 7th, right? Election day changes from year to year, but I chose November 7th of every year as sort of a proxy election day. And I took November 7th to January 20th, right? How many economically significant, right? Those are regulations that have an effect in the economy of $100 million or more. Generally, that's an economically significant regulation. How many economically significant regulations did OIRA look at between November 7th and January 20th of each year? And so we have each year. When you get to a transition period, spike. Now look at the budget and the resources. Or I guess, this is OIRA's budget. What do you see? Well, during the midnight period, it strips. It's the same number of people with the same number of resources at OIRA being flooded by regulations. So necessarily, I would think the amount of oversight and attention that can be given to the regulatory review is going to suffer. It's going to diminish. So, what can a new president do? There are a couple things. So, new president comes into office on the first day. First thing he can do is to rescind regulations. What does this mean? It means calling up the Federal Register and saying, stop the presses. Anything that hasn't been published in the Federal Register yet, he can just say, stop the presses, we're not publishing this, and that's it. It's not going to become, it never became a federal regulation. It's done. He can also tell all of the heads of the federal agencies, or at that point probably acting heads, saying if there's anything in the pipeline that's going towards Federal Register, stop. Just stop until a new agency head's appointed and we can review it and decide what to do with that. So anything that hasn't been published yet, you can just say stop right now. We'll take a look at it. The other thing you can do is to postpone effective dates of regulation. So these are regulations that have already been printed in the Federal Register. And from what I understand, it's questionable whether the president can extend the effective date just by issuing a memo. But the fact is that President Reagan, President Clinton, President Bush have all done it. As soon as they come into office, they send a memo to all the agency heads and saying, any regulations that have already been issued, they are now postponed. The effectiveness of those regulations is postponed for 60 days, for 90 days, while we review them and decide if we want to take any action on them. Now, the courts have said that you can't postpone a regulation indefinitely, right? Because that would be the same thing as just rescinding it or just repealing it by fiat. You can't do that. And there is a question about whether the president can just postpone willy-nilly, but the fact is the president have done this. And if you postpone something by 60 days, by the time it gets taken to court and resolved, it'll probably be longer than 60 days. So it might be a sort of question that really doesn't ever get resolved. So, number one, President can't stop rules that have not been published yet. President can't postpone rules that have been published. Here's something else that a president can do. This probably doesn't really fit here, but what about issuing a memo? What I'm referring to here is the Bulletin Memo. It's the Josh Bulletin Memo. Have any of you heard of this? Yeah, good, okay. So what is this? This is actually in this administration, President George W. Bush's Chief of Staff, Josh Bolten, issued a memo where he said, we don't want our legacy to be midnight regulations. We don't think we should have this spike, and we don't want this for ourselves. So we're committed to trying to avoid that. And so it said, this is a memo to all agency heads, saying, look, if you are planning on issuing any regulations between now and the end of the administration, you've got to finalize all rules, have them, all rules proposed by June 1st. And you have to have all rules done and final and published in the Federal Register by November 1st. Right? So that was 18 days ago, before the election. Now, some say that this is sort of, some cynics, right, would say this is sort of a little bit of underhanded. Because what this does is that it gets all of the regulation done before the election, so it's published, done, printed in the Federal Register. The new president comes in, he can't rescind it, and he's going to have a hard time postponing it, and he's going to might even have a hard time using the Congressional what's it called? Congressional Review Act. Thank you. Now, I'm not sure about that. I really take them at their word, and I think that this administration is sincere in not wanting to have a midnight period. I think they really like to avoid this spike. The problem is that the memo says all rules must be done and final by November 1st, except in extraordinary circumstances. Right? And again, I don't think that's sneaky or underhand. I think really you've got to have a clause in there that says except in extraordinary circumstances. The problem is that November 1st comes and goes, and everybody sort of, put out their rules that they were ready to put out. But then November 1st comes around, and there's this rule that they really just didn't get done by November 1st. And they go, Mr. President, I know about this memo. November 1st, I know, but this is sort of really important. And the president looks at it and says, yeah, you're right, that's important. And let's get that one through. And then the next person comes through and says, this one, I know about the memo. In general, in principle, we're against regulations, and I agree with that, but this one's kind of important. Yeah, you're right, that one through. And then this one, and this one. So in principle, in general, you can be against midnight regulations, but about this particular regulation, that one's important. And so pretty soon, they add up. And so how is the memo working out? Well, I looked at not economically significant regulations that OIRA has reviewed. And I took the period of November 4th, which is when we had an election this year, and November 19th, right? So I looked at the period between November 4th and November 19th, that's today, that's 15 days, in 2006, in 2007, and in 2008. So in 2006, OIRA looked at 24 not economically significant regulations and 2 economically significant regulations. It looked at it and approved those 2. In 2007, in the same period, they looked at 18 not economically significant and just 1 economically significant regulation. So what about this year? Between November 4th and today, I checked it this morning, OIRA has looked at 30 not economically significant and 13 economically significant. Yes, sir?
Why November 4th if the Bulletin Memo was based on November 1st?
The point I'm making with this is that despite the Bulletin Memo, because if you take the Bulletin Memo at its at face value, all regulations should have been done by November 1st. The only things that should be coming out after November 1st are things that are extraordinary circumstances. And what it shows is that the memo really isn't working out. And I really believe that they really wanted to avoid a midnight regulation situation. But the fact is we got it. We're in the middle of it.
Why are you picking out those years? Should it be 2008, 2004, 2000?
No, because I want to compare President Bush to himself.
Put President Bush to himself.
Right? And say, well, how did he do last year? Well, that's how he did. How did he do the year before that?
Well,
what about this year? And I could go back and, I only put 3 up there, But I can go back through all 8 years of his term, and he's really ahead of himself for this period.
It's a way to check the claim.
Yeah, the Bulletin
That
Memo.
it will be that this administration does not want any midnight regulation.
I understand. I understand. But if you have 42 regulations that come out in this period of time, and those are it, as opposed to 4,000 pages or
Can I address that?
6,000.
So the point of it, the problem though, is that it's only the 19th. He's going to continue to do this until January 20th, right? So it's going to grow. Yeah, yeah. Yes, sir.
Are you able to ascertain whether any of these regulations have to do with a financial bailout, or is there any distinction between what these regulations
Yes.
tend to do and then all the regulations that
Yes. Yes, I did look at that. I wish I had the data broken out. You can go to reginfo.gov and get all that information. But they're mostly DHS, HHS. I think they're mostly HHS. There's like 4 HHS. So you're right. You have to control for that. But I don't think that's going to account for the massive spike at the end of the term. Oh, okay. So, Congressional Review Act is another tool which is at Congress's disposal to address the midnight regulations problem. So, as you all know, Congress can always repeal a rule, right? Congress can always pass a law that says this rule, gone. It's no good. We don't like it. CRA, though, which was passed in 95, it's called the Congressional Review Act of 96, which is actually part of the Contract with America. What it does is that it creates a fast track for repeal of rules in Congress. So after a rule is final and published in Federal Register, actually no, it's sent to Congress for review. And especially when it's an economically significant rule, the rule cannot become effective for 60 days so that Congress can review the rule. Now, after it's sent to Congress, within 60 days, Congress can introduce what's called a joint resolution of disapproval. And once it does that, Congress, what the rule does, especially in the Senate, it shortens the committee process, it limits debate, and it allows, if both houses of Congress pass the joint resolution and the President signs it, I'm not pressing the buttons here. So if the President signs it after both houses have passed it, the rule is gone, as if it never happened. All right, so this is something that is going to be at Congress's disposal. It's only been used once. It was Bill Clinton's OSHA ergonomics rule, which was passed on practically his last day in office. This is something that was joint resolution was approved by a Democratic Senate and a Republican House, and President George W. Bush signed it. That rule was gone. So what's interesting about this is that the Congressional Review Act, you're only going to use it during a midnight period, or it's only going to really become important during a midnight period. And not just that, it's only going to become important when you have a president and a Congress of the same party. And why is that? Well, first of all, if you have a president that his administration just issued a rule and Congress passes a joint resolution against it, is he going to veto? Is he going to sign it? No, he's going to veto his a repeal of his own rule. So it's never going to really matter except when you have a transition. You then have to ask yourself, if you have a president that's succeeding another president of his own party, and the Congress repeals a rule using the CRA, is he likely to sign or veto that disapproval? Well, he's probably going to repeal it. Yes, sir.
So if you basically, if you're an incoming president, let's say, you have these 3 options as a question. If it hasn't been published, you just stop it.
Yeah.
If it has been published, you postpone it. If it's been final, if it's published and final, you go to the Congressional Review Act. Is that
No, the last 2 options are in parallel, right?
Okay.
If something has been published and it's final and it's been published, right? While what the president can do right off the bat is postpone it, just so it doesn't become effective until, for 60 days or so. This is in parallel, right?
Okay.
This is what Congress can do. And I imagine there's going to be conversation between the president and Congress about which regulations you're going to look at under this. Yes?
This is the legislative days, because obviously many of the regulations came out 2 days ago, and 60 days would mean that it would be before the election.
Yes. It's okay. So
60 legislative days, and it's based on
Right.
how many days Congress, the House and the Senate have been in session, and legislative days are counted differently depending upon whether it's the Senate or the House.
You should come
So
up here.
actually, you can actually go back probably as far as even July of a previous year to capture midnight regulations.
Comparing?
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah.
Okay, can I say something? Here's the thing. If a rule has not been submitted to Congress within 60 legislative days, okay, so let me
Three different kinds of counting.
all right, I'm going to say something, you tell me if I'm right or wrong. All right?
I'll tell if Curtis is right or wrong.
Okay. So yes, you have 60 calendar days to introduce the joint resolution. Hold on. But when do you start counting? And this is interesting that the CRA is so confusing. So I'm glad that between the three of us, we're going to get down to the bottom of it. You have 60 calendar days to introduce a joint resolution. However, when does the clock start ticking? Right? It's if a regulation is sent to Congress within 60 legislative days of it adjourning, it is treated as if it had been submitted on January 15th. No? Okay, so lay it on me.
The major rules are there has to be 60 days until they take effect.
Right.
Okay. So that's 60 calendar days.
Right.
The period for introduction of a resolution of disapproval is 60 days of continuous session.
Ah.
So it's days that both houses are in session or are not out of session for more than 3 days, essentially. So that's 60 days of continuous session to introduce a resolution of disapproval. If the rule is submitted to the House and Senate in the last 60 legislative days in the House, session days in the Senate,
Right.
which are counted differently, then it's rolled over to the next session of Congress and treated as if it's submitted on the 15th legislative day of that session. So it's not January the 15th.
Okay.
It's the 15th legislative day of the next session of Congress.
Right, but on the other hand, since it has to be days that they're consecutively in session, for example, since they're not in session in August.
Right, and the House hasn't been in session until the day since October 3rd.
First, right, so.
And if you count back 60 legislative days in the House, if you assume a 3-day
Right.
session this week and there's no more session days, you count back, you get to May the 14th.
Right.
May the
you could-
14th.
So you could actually capture regulations
So-
issued in July.
Any regulation published right now after May 14th would be rolled over to the next session
Right.
of Congress, and a resolution could be introduced on the 15th
Yeah.
legislative
Right.
day.
So bottom line, you can go back.
Let's sign an agreement.
You could probably go back as far back as this summer, capture rules that were issued as far back as this summer, and once you have, and then starting on the 15th legislative day of the new session, you can introduce a resolution within 60 you have 60 calendar days from that point, 60
days
session
of
of continuous session to submit that or to introduce that resolution. Once you introduce a resolution, however, that stops the clock, and then you can deal with it going forward, right? So even if you submit, tell me, this is education for me too.
Now, the action period in the Senate is 60 session days. And they have
Right.
60 session days.
To pass it?
But it's the key to the date that the rule is introduced, not the date of the resolution.
We're going to talk about that in a minute. So, so that's how you can deal with it. There's another way, which I'm going to suggest to you, which is a bit academic. Maybe it's a bit outside the realm of political possibility, but I'll tell you anyway. And that is that maybe a new president should consider a package, right? So he postponed the rules for 60 days. Maybe he should convene a blue ribbon committee to look through the rules, figure out which are the ones they don't like. I'm told that list already exists. And then have somebody in Congress introduce a package that repeals those rules. Remember, you don't need to use the CRA to repeal regulations. And if the Democrats have a 60-plus majority in Congress, perhaps, who knows, it might be possible to do. And what does the package approach do? It solves a collective action problem where you have different special interest groups who are going to be, who just got something in the last administration, are going to be very hard-pressed to give that up. So it addresses that concern. So what about the
What would stop you from introducing a CRA package?
From what I understand, the CRA asks you to have one resolution per regulation.
Right. So yeah, but you could actually roll all of those up into some other piece of legislation on a resolution.
I will leave that up to Congress to do, and if that's possible, I think it's a great idea. So what about the problem with OIRA? Right? Because none of this that we're talking about now solves the fact that OIRA's resources can't account for the spike at the end of each presidential term. So at the end of each presidential term, when you have a spike in regulation, OIRA is swamped. That's not addressed by postponing or anything like that. You want to stop the problem before it happens. So here's what we suggest. We suggest a cap on a number of regulations that OIRA can look at any one point. All right? So let's take a rolling 60-day period and say, within this time period, OIRA can't look at more than X number of regulations from a particular agency. Now that sounds a lot like a regulatory budget. That's not what we're suggesting. We're saying it should be a flexible cap. Why? Because there's sometimes when you might want OIRA to look at a whole bunch of regulations, maybe even at the midnight period. All we want to make sure is that OIRA has enough resources to give these rules the appropriate attention. Right? So you set the cap at a level that would never be reached, except maybe at a midnight period when you have just a huge dramatic spike. And you say, Congress, if you ever want more OIRA to look at more regulations, increase the cap. The President can probably do the same thing, but just shifting the budget. So that's it. Thank you, and now we'll take some questions, even though we've already had some.
Just take a second to thank the speakers today.
Thank you.
And also, just one quick reminder, if you guys haven't had a chance to fill out the survey form, you guys can do that before you head out. I appreciate it. And please, go ahead.
When you looked at the midnight regulations, did you parse in seeing the spikes independent regulatory agencies, like the Federal Communications Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission?
Yes and no. So when we looked at pages in the Federal Register, that's included because that's just in there.
Right.
The other way we counted it was OIRA reviews, and of course they're not in there.
Review those.
So, no.
Right. So presumably it would be interesting to see whether or not there is, because the chairmans of all the independent commissions will change, so it'd be interesting to examine what would happen from a midnight perspective, because the chairmans dictate the agendas of those agencies, including what rules are brought up before those agencies, whether or not they've actually pushed those agencies, whether they're trying to do the same thing that the executive branch agencies are trying to do.
If I can address that point, I mean, it would be interesting to have the data, but one of the things we need to keep in mind is why they do it, right? Whether it's because they try to push extend their influence into the future, or they're just trying to do things at the last minute, not even just to tie the hands of the incoming administration. It is very likely, it's human nature, that they are doing the same thing anywhere in government. So I suspect it would be really interesting to get the data, but I suspect we would find that in fact it is happening too, and because of the reason why it happens. It's the last day, you know. It's like before you go on vacation, you just rush to do all that last minute thing that you need to do, right? You don't go on vacation. So.
I bet you pack your bags in like little apartments.
But one of the things that's interesting about the midnight period and about the reason why it happens, right, is like because a lot of it is human nature and just kind of get organized and things like this, we can't really actually find solution or draft solution that would actually have an effect on the fact that it's going to happen. We are pretty much, resigned to the fact that it is going to happen. And that's why our solution is like, how can we mitigate the effect and the cost on the economy and this problem that we see really important, which is the lack of oversight.
Even if it's going to happen, if you have a cap on the number of rules of OIRA we can look at, well, first of all, maybe that cap will prevent it from happening. I doubt it will, but at least OIRA will get more resources to look at those rules.
Well, any cap would have to account for.
Why don't we give a chance to somebody else to ask a question? Anybody else? No? All right, floor. Oh, it's over here.
But that cap would have to take account of certain statutes, like, for example,
Yes.
HHS reviews some of the regulations you probably looked at involve like statutory mandates that HHS has to produce physician fee schedules by November 1st, for example.
That's right. Yeah, and so those will take priority. And when you have a cap, what you tell the agency is, and again, so number one, you set the cap really high, so you only approach it when you have an extraordinary spike like this. Number two, you're saying, you still have your budget of 5 or whatever, just prioritize it. Yes.
I have a question about the pie chart
Yeah.
that you have. I'm wondering if you
About the effectiveness?
compare, the overturn.
This one?
The effectiveness.
Yes.
You said that you didn't have information about how long it took for the modifications to happen. So you have 3 categories. You have withdrawn, modified,
Or repealed, really.
Or repeal it?
Not withdrawn. Withdrawn means
Yeah,
that before it ever got published, you withdrew it.
Like repeal.
No.
Okay.
These are all rules.
Which is a long process. I mean, it means going through the exact same process that it took to put it in place.
But my question is sort of, how does this statistic compare with non-midnight regulations? I mean, a new administration is going to review and repeal and modify all sorts of regulations that have been done in the previous administration. So if these numbers are similar to the numbers that you have normally, then we don't really have a phenomenon.
I don't answer.
I assume that. It's a good question, but I think that after the midnight period, there's such a vast amount, and there's a focus on it, and the new administration actually has a kind of incentive and a time frame that it knows it can actually do something about.
I would answer it differently. I would just tell you that the question we were looking to answer was, are midnight regulations an effective strategy? Right? And so, then we were just looking at.
Just want a pretty poor example, though, of midnight regulations, since he wasn't sure he was going to be out, and that was only his first term.
But it's still. Here we're looking at this. Here we're looking really at the new administration's action, the action taken, and it's in proportion.
So I count midnight period as election day to inauguration day. So by that point, President Bush knew he was out of office. But you're right. He definitely had
such a long process to get the regulation.
Right.
It was only his first term.
Exactly. So
he seems handicapped in that sort of way.
You're right. 2-term presidents who know they're going to be out no matter what have a running start. Yeah.
But here, because you look
But
at
they're still effective.
in terms of percentages, it actually somewhat take under consideration. It kind of like diminishes this criticism. But it is. I think it is still pretty stunning. And another thing that you could say is like maybe, the further we go.
They also changed the procedure. Barry, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
They also changed the procedure a lot by the end of the Clinton administration.
Mm-hmm.
They have a more orderly review.
That's true.
Yes.
And counter period. The Bush administration was dealing with the Well Commission, right?
Right.
They were just
Yeah, well-
not giving out reasons.
Then ignore.
Review at the end of the Clinton administration under Executive Order 12866.
Well, then just ignore. Just ignore. Let's not compare them, because it's like, we can't compare them. It's comparing orange to apple. And let's just look at the Clinton period, and that shows that under the current rules, and with the president's been in office for 8 years, it is an extremely effective strategy.
I want to go back to your question. So even assuming, I think what you're arguing, or what you're saying is, perhaps over the entire 8 years of President Bush, the next president is going to overturn all sorts of regulations over the whole period. Right. So even assuming that it's the same amount, it still shows that it's an effective strategy to try to regulate a team.
Well,
right?
or alternately, if the amount of normal regulations that are overturned is 1%,
right,
then it's not a very effective strategy.
Well, yes, but okay, you're relative to that. Except with that, you have also the fluid constraints. What the midnight period lets you do is do all sorts of things where you're unaccountable, right? Well, so is it an effective strategy to get those things through?
Except that you can't differentiate, or you haven't differentiated, between regulations that, between regulations that are in the normal course of events and regulations that account for the spike.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand.
No.
Okay, so there are two kinds of midnight regulations. Regulations that happen to fall during that period, that fell during that period in 2007, for example.
Right.
And regulations that are rushed through for this either nefarious or procrastinatory purpose.
Right. What? Yeah.
And
I don't count rules that fell during that period in any year except the transition year as midnight regulation. That's
what I'm saying is the type of regulation.
Right. What you're saying is that there's something in a pipeline that just happened to get published during that time.
Yeah.
Right.
In 2008.
And the probability,
in 2008, right.
And the probability that this will be amended or repealed
contributes to this. Yeah, perhaps. But I mean, look.
But the argument.
Are you suggesting that somehow there isn't a dramatic spike at the end?
No, there certainly isn't.
Okay. Are you saying that the repeal may be between 0 and 5 and 10, that 82 to 90 to 75 to 60 remain intact of that spike?
Well,
my point is it's effective. It's a huge spike and they stick around.